Hello and welcome to this training video on drug endangered children's programming. I'm Mark Brennan and I'm Project Director for Continuing Education Television at the Missouri Institute of Mental Health in St. Louis, Missouri. And with me today is Margene Searcy, who is the Project Coordinator for the Salt Lake City COPS Methamphetamine Initiative. As the coordinator of this multi-agency partnership, she and her colleagues have assisted the Meth initiative in accomplishing system-wide changes in Utah. The Salt Lake City COPS Meth initiative has received national recognition as an effective response to the methamphetamine epidemic. Hi Margene, how are you?
I'm fine, Mark. How are you?
Thank you, I'm fine. I'm glad that you're here with us today, sharing what I think is a lot of important information about the initiatives that you have developed in Salt Lake City and issues about methamphetamine use in general. I think a good place for us to start is to talk about the effects of methamphetamine on the community.
Yeah, methamphetamine on the community is really an interesting topic. If you look at methamphetamine and how it began as a California problem with their super labs, and then it started moving across the western United States, hitting Arizona and Utah and Washington, and Utah began seeing its lab problem right around the mid-90s, and by 1998 we were in this midst of an epidemic. We really were focusing on getting our first responders like law enforcement and child protection and our hazmat team geared and trained to respond to these scenes, and really put a lot of focus on that. But what we were seeing is a lot of children at these scenes that we didn't know what to do with. We didn't know what kind of exposure they had. If you have your teams that are responding that need to be, hazmat certified and geared up when they go in, what kind of long-term impact is that going to have on the kids? And then we had the environmental health impact. So after the lab's gone and the drugs are gone and the chemicals are gone, does that mean that that home's ready for a new family to move in, or do we need to do some other rehabilitation to the home to get it prepared for people to move in? So we were dealing with all of those issues.
So talk to us a little bit about the comprehensive community approach. What does that approach look like, and how does it abate methamphetamine use?
Well, in 1998, when we had this major problem, we were all of these agencies were dealing with the issue on their own. The court system had an issue, it had a piece in it, law enforcement did, child protection, the health department, treatment services, mental health services. They were all seeing the same individuals and dealing with the same issue, but they were dealing with it separately. So what we thought is, if we're going to have any long-term impact here, if we're going to have any substantial impact, and it was a big enough problem for us that we decided to bring the 30 agencies together to start working on these issues and start planning and developing what kind of programs or what kind of legislation changes, policy changes, protocol changes we were going to need for our community.
Oh, okay. How can substance abuse treatment, health agencies, mental health agencies become involved in responding to the methamphetamine epidemic?
Lots of ways. One of the things that we dealt with in Salt Lake City, as I talked a little bit about before, is the children that are exposed to methamphetamine and who live in these homes when there's manufacturing going on. And treatment in Utah was a really big part of that. They came to the table and we started talking about what kind of laws we needed to pass, and talked about some precursor laws to make it harder to get the chemicals to make the methamphetamine. And then we began talking about having children being exposed to drugs or paraphernalia being a first, second degree felony in Utah. So that was a really interesting thing to work through. Law enforcement and your judicial system thought that it was very important that we did that, because it's a victim crime and you're making a drug crime, which is traditionally not a victim crime, a victim crime. So it's much more stringent. And treatment services, their concern was, and mental health services, if you criminalize this, then you may have people that won't access treatment because of that. So what we did is we relied on our drug court system and additional treatment services to really assist with that. So as you charge somebody with a first degree or a third degree felony for having paraphernalia around their kids, having a meth pipe around their kid, what would happen is they would have the option to go into our dependency drug court system. And at that point in time, they'd see a judge every week, every 2 weeks, and be in treatment services at the same time, while the children were either in their care or in, a a kinship placement with a grandparent or something like that, why they got their treatment under control. So it was kind of like a plea in abeyance type thing.
Sure.
They're charged with it, but then they go into the system where they're really working on fixing the problem.
So they go into a drug program as opposed to just regular jail.
Correct.
Right? Okay. Why are children at additional risk who live in a home where drugs are being manufactured?
Well, the additional risks, you have a lot of chemicals that are stored in containers that aren't that don't have labels on it, or stored next to food in refrigerators or freezers. And there's the cross-contamination issue, the issue of the children. You know, if you have an open bottle of lye, and the child doesn't know what it is, and they get the lye on them. We had when methamphetamines manufactured. One process of the cook is you have meth oil, and the meth oil is at a pH balance that our bodies cannot tolerate. We actually had one child in Salt Lake City who actually picked up the meth oil. It looks a lot like apple juice and drink out of the glass, and she just basically doesn't have, you know, that part of her system. So those are the types of things. There's also loaded weapons, pornography, lots of traffic, and when I talk about traffic, I'm talking about people coming and going from the house. So there's lots of traffic, and a lot of those people have a criminal background, and you have them coming and going from the house, which places those children at higher risk.
That sounds like they would be at a high risk for all kinds of terrible things to happen. What are some of the risks Salt Lake City has found for children who are exposed to methamphetamine manufacturing and other dangerous drug activity?
Well, we found a few things. One of the things that we are very concerned about is some of the things that we're seeing on scene. As you know, if somebody's using it, if they're injecting it, then we're worried about the needles and things like HIV and hepatitis and those kinds of things. But we're also some of the things that we've done with the kids is on the scene where we have children, we use an ion scan. And to gather additional evidence. And what an ion scan is you'll see that at the airport, and they'll take the little swab and they'll swab your suitcase, and then they'll run that through, and it'll hit, if positive, if there's explosives on your baggage. That's what they're looking for. Well, that same piece of equipment can be calibrated to look for drugs. And so we calibrate it for drugs, and then we run it on bassinets and check it to see if it pops positive for drugs, or the kids' toys, or their beds. So that gives us additional information. And about, I would say, 85–90% of our cases with children, we have drugs throughout the home that way on their things. And so if you think about children with their hand-to-mouth behavior, young children, or if you're playing in that environment or eating off a plate from the kitchen, they're actually getting drugs into their system. And that's also supported by the hair analysis tests that we're doing on the children that are actually removed from the home. So if a child's found in a drug home, not just a methamphetamine lab, but if it's a high-use drug home or they're using methamphetamine or other drugs, we actually, through our medical process, have their hair tested, and it's showing that the drugs are metabolized in their system.
So it's possible that a child can be addicted and not even know it.
Well, and how do you respond to a child with a possible addiction issue?
Right. And we're talking children from very young ages on up, aren't we?
Yeah, we're we have children as young as a few months old, up to about 10 years old is the frame of children that we're working with. We do see some older children, but usually when they get a little bit older, they're usually part of the problem and are using themselves.
Oh, okay. Who are the key agencies in developing a response to the drug-endangered children?
It depends on what part of the nation you're in, which state you're in, what they see as their key agencies, but there's key agencies that go across the board, and those key agencies are going to be law enforcement, child protection services, the district attorney's office, and your medical component. So people who are responding to the medical needs of the children. In Utah, we actually feel that environmental health is a real key part, and they're one of our first responders. And they actually come in and look at the environment and decide if it should be closed that evening or not. Is it habitable for people to actually stay, or do we need to close the property down and have people go elsewhere? So we see that as the first responder. One of the visions I have that I'm hoping happens short term is I would really like to see treatment services be one of the first responders, because if you have the issue of a pregnant woman on scene, in Utah, there's not a lot of options. If a woman's pregnant, the jail won't take her in Utah because they don't want that higher risk. And so you have somebody who's doing criminal behavior and they're on scene and she's pregnant, then, you know, what are your options? Your best option is going to be to get her into treatment services.
Sure.
So if law enforcement and treatment services begin to have a good connection and a good relationship, then you'll see some of those things happening. So I see them as a really important part as well.
Okay, and can we talk briefly about family dynamics, generational effects, and also what those family dynamics have in terms of what's going on in criminal activity in the family?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of connection with children who are growing up in homes where there were criminal behavior or illegal drug activity, that they're growing up to be the suspects. So they may be a victim at one point, but then they grow up and they learn the behavior that their parents have taught them, and they continue to be in that environment, and that's they just kind of continue it on.
It perpetuates.
So some of the things that we really feel that's important is to break that generation issue. We have, 2 weeks ago, we did a warrant service on a home where a 10-year-old girl lived in the home. And her father had actually given her a fake gun and said, if anybody comes in that you don't know, pull this gun out and point it to him. And the father was thinking of protecting his daughter. I mean, he was very much into illegal drugs, packaging, distributing, and he thought, well, if anybody comes over to rob me or, you know, goes into my daughter's room, and then at least I've got her protected. Well, that poses a real potential harm to her, because as law enforcement came in with their search warrant, if she had actually acted as her dad wanted her to, it could have cost her life.
Yes, certainly could.
So, it's just that type of stuff. I see little kids when we work with them and their parents inject drugs, where they'll, act like they have a syringe or say, I know what that is. And so the children learn from the adults.
Sure.
That's how they learn their behavior.
And it becomes a part of their life.
Yeah.
What additional responses, policy changes, and legislation did Salt Lake City develop to address the methamphetamine usage?
We looked at it from a pretty broad perspective. We started with Precursor Laws. We wanted to make it really difficult to get the chemicals that you needed to make methamphetamine. It was very easy to make methamphetamine. You could actually go down to the supermarket, pick up everything you needed, bring it home, and cook up a batch of methamphetamine in about 4 or 6 hours. That's how easy it was. So we really wanted to focus on cutting off that supply for methamphetamine. So we put in really stringent precursor laws. I think Utah, I have people complain to me all the time that they can't buy more than 2 packages of cold medicine. So they're really stringent laws. Another thing we did is we looked at the environmental health impact. And so we wanted to do some type of legislation that would make it so that the properties were cleaned up before somebody moved back in. What we were seeing is people reporting respiratory problems and health problems due to moving into a home where there was a past methamphetamine lab. So we wanted to focus on that, and because we saw that as a community health issue.
Sure.
And we tried to run the legislation 2 years in a row, which failed. And then we had our Salt Lake County Health Department step up and say, we'll run this as a pilot project. And just this last year, we actually got legislation put through that takes those standards throughout the state of Utah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that was a really big effort, but it took us 4 years to get what we wanted. Another thing that we did is we looked at the child impact, and we made it a state law that if you exposed your children to drugs or paraphernalia and had that in their presence, that you would be charged with for either a first or second or third degree felony. And that's pretty big.
Sure it is. At that point, does DFS get involved if the family member has been jailed for endangering a child? I guess DFS would be involved as well.
They are. They're involved right at the scene with law enforcement, and that's one area that we really had to focus and make better, because what was happening in the beginning is law enforcement would call DCFS and say, we've got drugs and a child here. Well, DCFS doesn't, in the state of Utah at that point in time, didn't accept referrals based on illegal activity.
Oh, gosh.
And so they'd say, well, we're not accepting this referral, because law enforcement at that time didn't know to say, this child has not been changed, there's no food in the house, there's chemicals, there are these other issues, because their perspective is different than child protection. So we had to do a lot of cross-training, and now, and so what would happen is law enforcement would just place the child with somebody else in the home or a neighbor, and oftentimes that kind of activity was happening in that home, so you're just placing the child at risk. So what we now do is in Utah we actually have a protocol with DCFS, and they have an allegation for child endangerment. So law enforcement calls on the phone now, says we have a child here that's endangered, and it's they go out right within 20 minutes.
That taps into their procedural I guess import, so to speak, that DFS has certain things they need to hear, and the police, it sounds like, know those things to say now.
Correct.
Okay. I want you to briefly discuss the involvement of medical services, treatment services, child protection, environmental health, law enforcement, and the like with the drug-endangered children.
Yeah, one thing with all those things are being changed all the time. We always try to get better at what we're doing. And because we have the 30 agencies sitting at the table, we're able to do that. One thing with medical services is in the beginning, we were taking all of the children up to the emergency room from meth labs or high-use drug homes. All those children, when they were moved, went up to the emergency room. And what we found is that wasn't necessarily in the best interest of the kids, because the warrants are served 11, 2 o'clock in the morning, and then the children go from that environment where they've just been disrupted, people that they don't know have just come in dressed in black with their guns, their parents get arrested, and then they get to go up to the ER, which oftentimes they set 6 hours in the middle of the night. And then after they went to the ER and the doc did a few things, they sat in the waiting room most of the time, then they'd go out to the shelter, the children's shelter, and then they'd settle in. What we started thinking is, this isn't the best idea. So what we started doing is taking them directly from the scene to the shelter and getting them settled for the night, and then making an appointment the next day with the doc to go up and have them checked. And then you have an appointment, so they're not sitting and waiting a long amount of time. And what we're now looking at is emergency medical services actually coming out to the scene. And just kind of doing some vitals on the kid, because our concern is that we're going to miss. The reason why we were taking them to the ER is because, especially out of a meth lab, you don't know what that child's been exposed to. And as law enforcement and child protection services workers, they're not trained for medical. They can look at a child and see if there's anything physical, but a lot of these kids, it's not going to be a physical thing that you're going to see. Or you don't know what a normal breathing pattern is. So we're going to involve EMS and have them actually come in and just do a quick check on the kids, and then they can go up to the doctor the next day.
That sounds a little more stabilizing for the child. How did Salt Lake City involve the community in its response to methamphetamine?
We involve the community in a lot of different ways. We set up a drug hotline where the community members can actually call and report issues in their neighborhood. They're the best. They know what's happening in their neighborhood. And we provided a lot of community training so that they would know what to look for. Know to look for acetone, know to look for the tubing and, those weird things. And the traffic, how often people are coming and going from the residence. And the community has been really good. But what we also knew we'd need to do is, once we started getting those calls, if we didn't get to the calls, after somebody reported, if we didn't get to it pretty soon, they're going to get fairly frustrated with us. So we put a program together where we actually, instead of traditionally investigating a case, once we got a report like that, we'd take out addresses that we thought, this could potentially go really well if we just had a couple of officers show up and say, hey, there's a potential problem, we want to take care of it today, can we talk to you about it? And so a lot of our community complaints are dealt with that way, where you don't wait to do warrant service, you just go out there right away. And then we call the community members back and say, this is what we did, and just to let you know. And that way they're seeing officers right out there right away after they do a report like that. We also are doing a school drug awareness program right now, where we actually go in and talk to the kids about the National Institute of Drug Abuse Studies, and we talk to them about what drugs look like. And then we have matched it up with the What's Your Anti-Drug National Campaign, and so we have artists that will go in with the kids and develop artwork around what is their anti-drug.
Oh, good.
And then we've used that artwork downtown for our public awareness campaign on buses and
that's wonderful.
In downtown Salt Lake City, to really give the kids some involvement in making a difference in their community. So we just find ways like that we can involve the community in the meth issue.
And if I heard correctly, this is a 30-member consortium, I guess you might call it. Yeah, it's a lot of organizations.
It is.
Quite a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
Yeah, I bet. Thanks so much for being with us, Margene. I appreciate your time. If there's one summary statement that you'd like to make that you think that people would need to hear about your effort, what would it be? I
think that looking for the long term, planning long term instead of short term, instead of being reactive, be proactive, and then utilizing all the expertise that you have, because there's a lot of expertise in every community.
Well, thank you so much. That says it all. I would encourage everyone who's looking at this video to study more on methamphetamine use and drug use in general. Also, I'd like to encourage you to look at the key concepts and the glossary of terms, and if you do those things, you won't have any problem taking the test. Thank you and good health.